I've been reading the first Hellboy Omnibus recently and was struck by a few things, but the one that has been sat in my mind for a while is the really beautifully choreographed fight scene from The Wolves of St. August by Mignola, James Sinclair and Pat Brosseau. So I want to show how Mignola managed fights in early Hellboy, specifically this one, and how he comes to rely on a couple of different techniques and tricks, and importantly the colours of Sinclair to make a bombastic, pulpy beat-em-up in comic book form. You're watching Strip Hal Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. So I think the first thing to note before we get into the fight is often how dense Mignola makes a lot of these early Hellboy pages, both in terms of panel count and word count. In the early parts of the story, there's typically around 6 to 9 panels a page, and a large chunk of those are covered in dialogue or captions. It's slow going as a read, with each of these panels kind of stopping you and slowing you down, and the vast amount of words in each making the read a much slower one than you might expect from modern comics. None of that is a bad thing, of course, it's just nicely setting the tempo for the story. I think it's also worth talking about how this approach also balances budget and story economics. Because when we get into the fight scene later, we'll see how different the approach is, but while telling the story in comics, you're always limited by a page count, which sort of serves as your story budget in a sense. You can do whatever you want on a page, but it's the amount of pages that's going to limit you. So if you want to spend 10 pages on one fight, for example, out of a traditional 20-page story, you're kind of going to limit what you can do in each of those halves of the story. So what Mignola does is front-load his exposition and plot to give him the freedom and time to do more action later in the issue. It's quite an interesting technique because, I'm personally not the biggest advocate for an overly wordy comic, but Mignola still manages to create a balance in the opening half of these pages. He's got pages which are very dense, for example this one, it's just full of captions as Katie discusses some of the backstory of the issue in this 9-panel page. And then a page later he'll open it up a little bit more, easing back a touch, letting the rhythm of it ebb and flow. I'm not sure how much of this is instinct versus design so much, but you can see Mignola isn't constantly overloading it page after page after page. And the other thing to note here is Sinclair's colours, and we'll talk about this a lot in this episode. Very little in Hellboy tends to be red, other than the man himself, and even blood is quite subdued in comparison. Sinclair opts for earthy tones quite a lot, this kind of like sandy brown, yellow thing being noticeable across a lot of the early issue, and then the green when Katie talks about the history. So for the most part, Sinclair chooses to render the regular world, so to speak, in soft, natural tones. And it has the benefit of, very purposefully, making Hellboy look out of this world. In these early pages, he rarely fits in with the palette, this soft sort of pastel blue and yellow, so Hellboy becomes this otherworldly creature on the page, something which Mignola's line work does not necessarily convey itself, because his line work is constant across all the characters, supernatural or not. But Sinclair brings this deep red to make sure we know Hellboy never ever belonged here. Similarly, when Katie talks about the history of these creatures, the beasts and the shape-shifting, this bold green comes into play, again a touch of the otherworldly palette by Sinclair. So we get the visual clue that anything that isn't a soft palette tone probably isn't of this world, which I'm, saying in air quotes for emphasis. Okay, so now we're a bit into this episode and you're thinking, Hass, we're supposed to be talking about a fight scene here. I am, but it is important to establish the language and tone that Mignola and Sinclair build through the opening of the issue first. Okay, so let's get to that fight and we'll sort of show how it throws all of this stuff away. The pages leading directly up to the fight are still quite dense verbally, but they've switched to this kind of green turquoise palette now that they've gone deeper underground in the world. A quick word in this too, because much like when they were outdoors earlier, Sinclair gives absolutely everything an overcast of this one tone. So if you look at Katie's face, for example, it's the pink she's normally coloured as, but it's got this blue cast over it. Hellboy's coat is the same kind of blue-grey, everything here except Hellboy, who's red constantly, and he blocks any kind of forced colour overlay that anyone else might get. The page before William Genier reveals his demonic wolf form, the language quickly changes. There's still a ton of dialogue, but suddenly we get these big close-up shots that position the bluey green against the red, Hellboy versus the beast. Then 2 stacked panels, and finally the page where Grenier's skin is ripped away, and the beast takes up a huge amount of the page. Hellboy and Katie still have about a quarter themselves at the bottom, and Mignola can kind of get away with that, because 3/4 of a page is still a large majority compared to the dense pages he's established previously. So even though it's not a big splash, which you might expect from modern day superhero comics or something similar, this moment still has a ton of power, because it's not really playing against comic conventions so much as it is playing against its own comic conventions. And then the fight starts proper. So over the next few pages, you can see how the panel count drops dramatically, with no more than 3 panels per page for the sequence. Every panel across these 4 pages is also full page width, the action almost going widescreen when the punching starts. The dialogue is kept to a minimum, and the rendering is reduced dramatically too. There's basically no backgrounds, and it almost becomes shapes, like here the beast is almost entirely shadow, and Hellboy the same. So the focus then becomes on form and shape and impact, rather than specific detail. And by doing all this, Mignola is able to speed the fight up, while still making it look huge and bombastic. And the next page has 3 panels, and all the qualities are exactly the same. Brosseau bumps up the lettering, this ack being huge and filling in for sound effects, and Sinclair puts a single colour background against each image, only purple and turquoise. In each of these 3 panels, exactly the same thing. Rendering force to shadow, a focus on form and shape within the panel instead, and a minimizing of background elements. Here, just some bricks to show they've likely, smashed through a wall or hit something hard. And even when we get our first splash, this only beast, the decisions are the same, the splash just being used for scale and a beat. And mostly, barring 2 noticeable exceptions, the whole fight looks like this. So the first of those exceptions is when the dialogue comes back in to set up the finale. There's a split tier and a lot more dialogue from Hellboy here as he reinforces why he's about to kill this beast. The next page has the same look, and again there's this kind of emphasis on Hellboy's dialogue in the middle of the page. And there's actually a couple of other moments in the fight that bring in these kind of split tiers, but it all comes down to the same reasoning, I think, of giving something a more specific action. So for example, in an earlier page, Hellboy picks up a bit of statue, and it's broken down into a few panels. And the other big exception is Sinclair's colours for this one huge moment right at the end of the fight. And this is the moment that does end the fight, and this bright yellow comes in. Completely different than everything we've seen otherwise, no grounding in the world around them, it's an entirely expressive panel and use of colour. Like a shock to the system, it wakes up that moment, it wakes up that page, and it makes it bigger than anything else. All through Sinclair maintaining a limited palette for the rest of the story to allow this moment to shine. Because Mignola renders this instance in basically the same way he does all the other fight beats. And so the panel's focus does become this yellow. It's the main thing we have to focus on. So this otherwise unnoticeable background element traditionally is the star that makes this the end of the fight, and it gives it this big blast of magic. And I love this approach so much. It's essentially a 15-ish page fight sequence in what is only a 40-page story. So over a third of this story is 2 creatures beating each other up, and yet because of the way Mignola front-loads exposition and setup, you still get quite a lot of story information that makes that payoff and the ending feel like a suitable bit of closure. Hellboy shuts down another monster with a ton of the expected lore of the Hellboy franchise and the big punchy fighty stuff people expect. But it's more than that. It's a delicate balance of story, panel count, colours, rendering, and setting up reader expectations from mode of telling the story. Sinclair, Mignola and Brosseau spend a large majority of this comic in a kind of restraint, doing the necessary steps, pulling back constantly in order to make the ending work in the dramatic fashion it does. Some comics excel on visual bombast, page after page after page, and some on small subtlety to set a tone. Hellboy is the latter. A comic about a blood-red demon from hell. It's so beautifully subtle. And it's all done with such grace and ease, and there's a lot to learn from the storytelling in Hellboy, and here is just a little sample of it. Thanks for watching. You can support Strip Panel Naked on Patreon, where there's over 2 years of exclusive content to dive into, just click the button on the screen. And you can find my Eisner-nominated magazine at gumroad.com/panelxpanel, and follow me on Twitter at HassanOE. And click subscribe and the notification bell to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and I will see you next time.